This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed. No alarms went off. And that is exactly the problem. What is happening right now is quieter than a crisis and more dangerous than one, because the system is still running, the paperwork is still filed, the courtrooms are still open, the titles are still being used, but the rules underneath them are no longer agreed upon. Somewhere inside the machinery, a line was crossed. Not dramatically, not publicly, just enough to test whether anyone would stop it. And when someone did, the response wasn't correction. It wasn't hesitation. It was acceleration. If you care about how power is supposed to work in this country, stay with me. Because once you see this mechanism, you can't unsee it. What looks like order is something else entirely. And we're about to trace where it actually comes from. I want to slow this down for just a moment, because what controls this system now is not outrage. It's not loyalty. It's not even ideology. It's momentum. Institutions don't collapse when bad actors take over. They collapse when procedure keeps moving after legitimacy breaks, when forms are filed because they've always been filed, when authority is asserted because no one has successfully stopped it yet. Power in this moment is not coming from elected officials or judges or statutes. It's coming from continuity, from the assumption that if something looks official long enough, it becomes official. That's the shift. The system is no longer asking, is this lawful? It's asking, who's going to force us to stop? And that's a very different question, because it turns oversight into a nuisance and compliance into an obstacle. Once that logic takes hold, personalities stop mattering. The machine runs on precedent-by-exhaustion. And that brings us to the part that changed quietly, the moment when rules stopped being guardrails and started being suggestions. There was a time when this would have stopped everything, before a ruling meant containment. One case paused, others waited. Titles mattered because they were anchored to permission. Now the response is different. Now a line can be declared invalid in one place and ignored everywhere else. The system doesn't correct. It routes around the problem. Before, legality was binary. You were authorized or you were not. That distinction carried weight because it threatened disruption. Now, illegality is treated as local weather, inconvenient, temporary, not a reason to shut anything down. This didn't happen overnight. It happened through repetition, through silence, through the quiet normalization of just this once. Slow change is always the most dangerous kind, because nothing feels urgent while it's happening. By the time it's visible, it's already embedded. And once embedded, the question is no longer how the system should work. It's how much deviation it can absorb before anyone forces a reckoning. That reckoning didn't start with a crisis. It started with a response. And that response is where things begin to fracture. What finally broke the silence wasn't chaos. It was paperwork, a routine filing, a signature block, a title that carries authority because the system treats it as real. A judge noticed that something didn't line up, not politically, procedurally. The name on the page claimed power that another court had already said did not exist. Not in theory, not as an argument, as a matter of record. In an older system, that would have triggered a halt. Everything downstream would freeze because contamination matters. Instead, the response was immediate and revealing. The court was told it had misunderstood, that it had overstepped, that questioning the legitimacy of that authority was itself an abuse. The problem wasn't the false claim. The problem was noticing it. And suddenly, the shock wasn't about one filing. It was about what happens when a system insists that even if something is unlawful, no one is allowed to say so. That's not a legal disagreement. That's a stress test. And what it exposed was not a mistake, but a reflex, because this is where the mechanism reveals itself. The system did not defend legality. It defended insulation. The argument wasn't, this authority is valid. It was, you are not allowed to question it. What matters here is not who signed the document. It's who absorbs the risk when that signature turns out to be hollow. The benefit flows upward. Continuity, speed, control. The damage flows outward. To defendants who now have to wonder whether the person prosecuting them is real, to courts forced to relitigate legitimacy instead of substance, to the system itself, which starts accumulating invisible cracks. This is how the machinery actually works. Illegality is treated as a technicality. Oversight is treated as interference, and exhaustion becomes a strategy. If every challenge takes months, if every objection is framed as misconduct, eventually fewer people raise them. Not because they're wrong, but because the cost is too high. And once that balance shifts, the system doesn't need to break the law openly. It just needs to keep moving, which is exactly what happens next. The pace changes here because once defiance works once, it gets reused. Fast. A ruling lands, it's narrowed, localized, declared irrelevant somewhere else. Another case moves forward anyway. Another filing, another signature, no pause, no correction. No recalibration. Judges notice. Quietly at first, then out loud. And each time, the response is the same. Dismiss, delay, deny authority. This isn't confusion, it's training. The message is simple. Push back, and you become the problem. Insist on rules, and you'll be accused of breaking them. So the system accelerates, not because it's confident, because slowing down would expose too much. Every unchecked action raises the cost of reversal. Every day forward makes yesterday harder to unwind. This is how mini-crises stack, none of them fatal alone. Together, irreversible. And now the pressure doesn't come from outside the system. It comes from inside, from the risk that someone finally refuses to move on. And that's where this stops being abstract. And this is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, not as a theory, as a condition you live inside. Because when authority becomes optional, certainty disappears first. You don't know who actually holds power. You don't know which rulings matter. You don't know whether process will protect you or simply pass over you. If you're accused, legitimacy becomes a question mark. If you're a witness, credibility becomes negotiable. If you're just watching, trust erodes quietly and permanently. This isn't about whether you like the people involved. It's about whether the system still recognizes limits. And once it doesn't, the burden shifts onto defendants, onto judges, onto you, because someone always pays for institutional shortcuts. It's just rarely the people who benefit from them. If this feels distant, stay with me, because what happens next determines whether this remains contained or becomes the model. What started as a local defiance doesn't stay local for long, because systems watch each other. Courts notice when rulings are ignored. Governments notice when procedure bends without consequence. Other institutions take notes. The signal travels quietly. Authority can outpace legitimacy. Continuity can outrun consent. Once that lesson spreads, the behavior scales. Not identically, adaptively. One system learns it can proceed without authorization. Another learns it can delay oversight indefinitely. Another learns that exhaustion is more effective than persuasion. This is how norms collapse internationally. Not through coups, through mimicry. What looks like an internal dispute becomes a precedent, and precedents migrate. Suddenly, this isn't about one court or one jurisdiction. It's about whether modern systems can correct themselves once they've learned how to ignore the brakes. And here's the destabilizing truth. No one knows where the boundary actually is anymore, which means the next phase isn't correction. It's acceleration into futures that are no longer theoretical. From here, there are three paths forward. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The system quietly rewrites its own rules. Titles change. Processes are patched. Legitimacy is redefined after the fact. Order is preserved, but only by shrinking what lawful means. The second path is erosion. Challenges continue. Rulings conflict. Authority becomes inconsistent. Cases pile up. Trust drains slowly, unevenly, until compliance becomes selective. The system still exists, but no longer coheres. And then there is rupture. One refusal too many. One case that cannot be routed around. One moment when continuity collides with a hard stop. Everything upstream is suddenly in question. Everything downstream freezes. No one knows which path will dominate. They can coexist, they can overlap, they can shift without warning. What matters is this. Every day the system moves forward without resolving legitimacy, the cost of any future correction increases. And whatever comes next will not feel sudden, it will feel overdue. Which brings us to the moment we're not supposed to talk about yet. There is a temptation at the end of stories like this to look for reassurance, to believe that the system will correct itself, that norms will snap back, that someone, somewhere is in control. But nothing in what you've just seen supports that comfort. What holds systems together is not power. It's shared agreement about limits. And when those limits are treated as optional, the system doesn't collapse. It drifts. It drifts until legality becomes a technicality, until authority is asserted by repetition, until oversight is something you work around instead of answer to. This is not a warning about what might happen. It's a description of what is already underway. The only unanswered question is scale. How far this spreads, how long it lasts, how much damage is absorbed before anyone forces a stop. That's not something we'll resolve tonight, or in one case, or in one ruling. But if you want to understand what comes next and why it won't look like the crises you expect, you'll want to stay here. Because this system is still moving, and the most dangerous part is that it's learning as it goes.